Okay, great. Well, hi everyone. My name is Felix from Salad Ventures, and I'm very honored to obviously be able to moderate this panel on a very interesting topic, especially considering that this is happening in a BGA event. Now, the way that I'll be moderating this panel will be slightly different from the ones that have been moderated differently. I prefer a much more open floor style, a more free flow style. So we don't all have to answer every single question. So please just feel free to answer questions that resonate the most with you so that we can keep the conversation flowing more smoothly, okay? So let's go on to the first question. And the first question is this. I'd like to know, on behalf of the audience, what are some of the most promising innovations and tools built on Ethereum that are advancing public goods funding, and how are they enhancing transparency, efficiency, or scalability for social impact projects? So anybody who feels comfortable, feel free to jump in.
I mean, you mentioned public goods, so I feel like I have to, mention something. Maybe it's not specifically public goods related, but I would say like the application I'm most excited about right now is actually stablecoins. And the reason is that I think if you look at a lot of developing economies, the thing that they need most is financial stability. So I've actually been really heartened to see a lot of payment solutions across Africa and developing economies starting to be more adopted. And I've been specifically excited about the experiments around pop-up city Crecimiento in Argentina. And I just think those are like doing really great work. But in terms of how we're actually funding public goods, there's like this huge range of projects that are emerging. So obviously Gitcoin was kind of this catalyst for the concept of public goods funding in Web3, where we didn't invent it, obviously. I mean, governments have been doing this for like, centuries or longer. And I think actually the furthest back example I can give is to the Sumerians of like the 3000 BC. They like did irrigation systems together. But I would just say that like there's some of the ones I would mention are Optimism's doing amazing work with RetroPGF, Octant, some of the work that's happening on the Ethereum Foundation side with some of the initiatives that maybe you can talk about are doing really really well. But just to give some specific examples beyond the stablecoin front.
I think in terms of innovations, some of the ones that Scott has already mentioned, the experiments that Optimism is doing with RetroPGF and trying different allocation mechanisms for every round, I think is super interesting. Karma Gap is a super interesting concept. Creates like a accountability protocol for grantees that allows them to mint NFTs that they can then use to prove that they've done the work that they were given to do as a grant. I also think Octant is doing really cool things by staking and then using the yield from staking to then reward mostly open source software projects. And then I think obviously, Gitcoin has done really cool things with quadratic funding, and there's, I think, an explosion of different experiments in how we fund public goods on Ethereum. A lot of them, aren't going to work, but I think we're in a stage where we're seeing a lot of like new innovations, new ideas, and if we keep iterating, I think we'll find something that will work.
Just to add one thing is, I think a lot of the innovations being done by Optimism and Gitcoin and others are now being adopted by other projects within the ecosystem, which is great. So at DV Labs, we're a contributor to Obel, which is helping to kind of decentralize and help scale the validator ecosystem in Ethereum and other chains. And we've learned a lot from Optimism and took a lot of inspiration. And we also have a retroactive funding mechanism in our protocol. And on top of that, also learning a bit from Octant and others, we've built that into kind of the mechanism. We take a percentage of staking rewards and inject that into the retroactive fund that then has a governance mechanism for how it's going to be allocated to support kind of further decentralization in the validator ecosystem in Ethereum. So I think a lot of that's being taken and now innovated upon and adopted and applied in different ways. And so I see that kind of happening throughout the Ethereum ecosystem as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. Really appreciate it, and it's good to see you all and meet you all here. I think the stablecoin thing. I won't say anything more than you did. That's something that's always exciting to me, and one of the reasons that I got into this field to begin with. And then I'm glad Rodrigo helped Scott out and plugged all the good work that Gitcoin's done with the quadratic funding, because that was something that was on my mind too, coming into this. Mine's a little bit left of center for, I think, the rest of the panelists, so I'm actually going to talk about something a little bit off-chain. So Immunefi, we specialize in security for projects of all sizes, for projects of all intents, so long as they're good intents. And the biggest thing that we see, right, is this, in terms of getting security, one, we want to make sure it's accessible to everybody. How do you do that? The second is scaling security. How do you do that when there's a finite amount of auditors, et cetera? So there's a few things we do. The first is offering some advisory to folks, particularly on the early side when we can. We try to give back to a lot of public goods. Something we're working on with the Ethereum Foundation right now is kind of in that public good realm. And then the big thing is there's been a huge change in mindset, even in just my limited time working in the security space of crypto and Web3 and blockchain, which is more openness to getting not away from the traditional audit, but augmenting it with crowd-sec security, which is the only way we're going to scale this with these, unlimited to a degree. We're going to bring more people into the tent as we go, getting more Web2 folks that are studying and working on Web3. And if we can scale security, we can scale people's ability to have faith that these security mechanisms are going to work, and we can create new ones along the way, because it's still a very nascent industry. I think that's from my seat where we're going. It's a little off-chain, left of center, but of the conversation, but I think hopeful.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to talk about the biggest challenges developers face in creating sustainable funding models for public goods in decentralized ecosystems. How can these challenges be addressed to support long-term impact?
Yeah, maybe I can start here. I think one of the actually biggest public goods of Ethereum is decentralization. It's something that everybody believes in. It's something that drives, frankly, the ecosystem. But when it comes to actually funding and supporting decentralization, it's kind of a public good. And we feel it, actually. So one of the biggest things that we're trying to do is to boost the solo staking ecosystem, the home stakers, right? And there's been a lot of debate in the Ethereum ecosystem about issuance and supporting home stakers. What's the role of home stakers? And we see a lot of actually public good coming out of home staking. For example, we work with home stakers in different parts of the world. And in Africa, for example, there's people using Starlink to actually run validators. And those are great stories. You're getting more people in different parts of the world involved in participating and securing Ethereum and being a part of this kind of global ecosystem. But it's really hard to align incentives because there's sometimes trade-offs. And so I think the key to solving these long-term is to find, and I'm probably stating the obvious here, is how do you align the incentives such that it makes sense to further the things that you're trying to solve with public goods. And so I think solo staking is one prime example of that in the Ethereum ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, which is actually it's sort of like the meta point of what you said is ideas in this space and the culture is sort of its own public good. Ethereum has a very specific set of values, and those values propagate, and that's actually very useful because you have to actually encourage people to sometimes do things to start that may not be economically viable. But over time, if you do enough of them, it can hit this critical mass and become economically viable. So I think it's a really important point, especially for staking. But I would actually add that I think that there's one really interesting conversation around venture funding in crypto right now, and what is the role of venture funding. And I would actually argue that one of the most interesting conversations to have is so we have all this software that's creating these positive externalities. How do we basically treat those externalities and price those externalities using the same incentive mechanisms that we have, and give those back to things like the not the solar staking, but also I guess solar staking with the Starlink sort of connection. How do we bring that sort of full circle? And I think there's a lot of conversations starting to happen around that in the ecosystem. I think that's something that has been on my mind with public works on more of the venture side. And it's a question of what Vitalik has talked about in terms of this idea of the revenue evil curve, where you kind of have to ask the question, what types of software are monetizable without actually becoming enclosed or becoming restricted? and what types of software need this sort of like broader grants funding, public goods funding, and cannot monetize. And I think if we start to ask those questions and sort of identify that for each project, we can start to build a much more robust ecosystem of projects, which sort of has already implicitly happened in Ethereum, because I mean we have a lot of these projects giving back already, and this is already sort of part of that flow. But maybe the last quick point is just all of this sort of funding didn't happen in traditional open source software. There was never really a time where people cared about funding open source developers, which is why you had like Heartbleed and all these sort of issues in say like 2015 or more recently with other libraries. So it's heartening to see that like we sort of have this culture of supporting open source, and those are just a few ideas I think on like how we can make that more robust.
I think one of the biggest challenges in the Ethereum ecosystem is how much of this is based on open source software. And it kind of creates a tragedy of the commons, because we all use these dev tools, libraries, but there's really no incentive to fund them. And what we've kind of created in the last few years is a cultural expectation of funding with things like Protocol Guild, and I think that's the first step, is creating the culture that we do fund the things that we build on top of. But I do think there's limited returns to that, and I think eventually there will be funding fatigue, and we will need to find other ways of incentivizing the funding for open source public goods that we build this network on top of.
Okay, just continuing on this topic also, I'm just very curious what, if any, what emerging Ethereum-based tools or frameworks have the most potential to enhance public goods funding? How can these tools also be integrated into the broader blockchain ecosystem for global adoption?
I think we've hit on a lot of them actually already in the beginning. I think retroactive funding as a mechanism is something that can be iterated upon and adopted. One thing that we're experimenting with this retroactive fund is like, how do we get the ecosystem bought into this taking a percentage of staking rewards, which is embedded in the protocol, and having that be injected back into funding projects that help to decentralize Ethereum. And so like, I think those are things that can, if we can, get the adoption, get the buy-in, and make it Lindy, if you will, make it accepted as part of how people run validators and just what people factor into a percentage of staking rewards. I think it's that acceptance that'll scale, right? And so part of it is just convincing everybody. That's the hard part. And I think once you get that, that's when you have scale. And so you just have to make it baked into the actual economic model of how you fund these public goods.
Yeah, I would maybe just add like maybe one spicy take is I actually think we should probably build some degree of funding into the protocol. Maybe no, I think that's going to be a hard sell. I think there was some conversations around this at one point with like contract secured revenue, where basically it's like every contract has essentially some portion going back. You had some experiments around this, which I think maybe had mixed results with like the Zcash developer fund. So I think maybe there's some hesitation on doing this. But I do think that once you start to get and I can see why, because like you get this problem of credible neutrality with the protocol. But I think if you have lists like what Protocol Guild has, and you have some kind of neutral party that can start to adjudicate that, and you keep the funding, at least to start, relatively small, I think it's at least possible to pilot the idea without like just totally breaking things down. So I would just start that way and think about like, what are like the meta allocation lists, or like, I think there's some people talking about like the idea of like a guild. It's like a meta guild of just all these different, like maybe there's a dev tooling guild, or like a Solidity guild, or like Protocol Guild only covers a very narrow range of things, right? So intentionally. So I think it's important to just think through like, how can we start to encourage that? Because otherwise, yeah, the funding fatigue is a real problem where people don't actually, if you have to think to donate to something, like, half of the time I think Gitcoin spends is trying to convince people to donate to things. It's a very long process. So I think that if you can make that a thing that happens automatically, it solves a lot of the sort of attention deficit.
Just to add to that, I almost think we have to strip away this idea that you're donating to something. Like I feel like that actually disincentivizes people from investing in something. Like that's actually the better word. Is like if you invest in public goods, there's future benefit for you and for everybody else, right? And so I think that's the more important point to kind of think about is like this is not you giving money to something. This is you investing in something that would have returns in the long run.
Yeah, that's actually one thing, just quickly on that'd be really interesting is like, so for something like Ethers.js, let's say, like there's I forget which, there's like a traditional accounting firm or consultancy that did this, but like they calculated the replacement cost of all open source software, and it was something like $9.8 trillion. It's like if you were to just like throw it out, start from scratch, it would be like an extremely high amount of money to just replace that for every single company or every single group that uses that. So like maybe having some calculus of like what's the replacement cost for Ethers.js, or like what's the replacement cost for like Peter from Geth or something. I don't know. Like I think that would be a useful measure. And I don't know, something futarchy. Maybe there's like a way to like sort of like somehow estimate that. But I think that'd be interesting.
So far, most of the experimentation that we've done in public goods funding has been with allocation mechanisms, and I think there's a lot of space still to experiment with incentivizing donations or incentivizing the funding of dependencies, because it is kind of like a prisoner's dilemma. We could like defect and then we all lose if we don't fund the things that we rely on, or we can cooperate and we're not getting the maximum payout for us individually, but for everyone in aggregate, it's better to cooperate. And so seeing some of like the experiments with like mixed incentives, I think is something that's interesting and still open. I know like Kevin has been talking about the guild and finding ways of turning the Sankey diagram of public funding in Ethereum into something that looks like from many to many to something that looks more like from few to many. I think there's also space to experiment with mixed incentives. We've been operating in a really difficult climate in the US, and that's prevented us from being able to use some of the tax incentives that are available there. But I think there could be some experimentation with that could give more of an alignment for US-based companies to give back to the projects that they build on top of.
I think you make a great point in changing the way you talk about doing these things, because I shouldn't give away the state secrets here, right? But there sometimes when I go to sell something in our for-profit environment, I say we can give it away the first time because people don't expect free twice, right? This is like the inverse of that. This is like people saying, I'm going to go ahead and do something. I've checked that off my list. I've done it. But if you we have to figure out a way where people feel like this is a repeatable reflex that should be done because they're getting repeatable utility out of all of the things that have been built here. One of the things we're lucky enough to be able to participate in is a lot of the grants you're all talking about. And one thing that it enables us to do, just as a real world example, is make sure, like I mentioned earlier, we kind of see security as an inalienable right for folks. So if we're able to go ahead and participate in the retro PGF funding, or certain milestone type funding arrangements that we've done with Optimism, that we've done with other L2s as well, we're able to make sure that we can pass that along to projects of all sizes. We do that for projects of all sizes. We do that for projects of all intentions. Many of them here that would make good candidates to be discussed here with BGA. And that brings in more folks who are looking at different angles of which you can use the blockchain from our SRs. We have 45,000 security researchers today in our community, and that's growing. We're seeing a lot of influx from the Web 2 space, which is fantastic. So the more folks that we can bring over to do this stuff, the more they're exposed to. Some of these folks who are security researchers are also developers, right? So they'll start to recognize, oh, this is a place where I can build. This is a place where I can do something great as well, or they can just help keep it secure in one way or another. So as a recipient of those grants, we recognize how important it is. We try to also do the same and give back to a lot of these organizations, like some work that we're doing at Ethereum Foundation. We're doing some similar stuff with Arbitrum and Optimism as well. And so we try to give back as much as we get, if not more. But just as someone who's been a recipient of those and seen the outcomes we're able to provide for folks who might not be able to afford a proper security stack otherwise, and that's just one angle. It's one pillar of probably, you know, a five-legged stool that people need to do. It's super important, and I really like your point about changing the way we talk about it and the verbiage that we use, so we create that repetitive reflex instead.
Thank you, Mike. So in closing, I'd like to ask you, all four of you gentlemen, just one question, and hopefully you can keep it quotable length. So the question is this: if you could make one protocol level change on Ethereum to better support a more sustainable public goods funding initiative, what would that protocol level change be? So maybe Scott. Quotable length.
Quotable, that's the hard part really for me, I think. I would just say contract secured revenue or equivalent quotable length. I mean, fund protocol guild with block rewards.
Good try.
I don't think protocol level changes are necessary, but really it's what the protocol enables us to do in terms of coordination that I think is the big unlock for public goods funding.
Yeah, this one's probably above my pay grade, so I'll defer to these gentlemen here for the quote.
Yeah, man, I would say like bake public goods funding into the core mechanisms, and it doesn't have to be the protocol itself, but I think like the core funding mechanisms of the protocol, whether that's through block rewards, whether that's through some kind of Ethereum Foundation type of mechanism, right? Because I think it is difficult to find sources of funding for public goods today in the ecosystem, and I think that needs to be more sustainable in the long run. And like I know Gitcoin's doing a great job, but like there needs to be more of the inflows, not just figuring out how to allocate the funds themselves.
Okay, and with that, we've come to the end of this panel. Thank you, gentlemen, for your time and insights. I look forward to continue this discussion offline. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our tech panelists.